Okay, I think it's about 4:30, so welcome everyone to the College of Environment Environmental Speaker Series, collaboration with the Salish Sea Institute, focusing on the Salish Sea this quarter. My name is Stefan Freeland. I am the coordinator of the series, along with the folks from the Salish Sea Institute. As always, I ask those of you in the room, turn off those cell phones, put them away, shut your laptops, put away your tablets. We can just have your full attention up here and no digital distractions. Gonna have a great talk, and you don't need all that. And those of you on Zoom, welcome, glad to have you. Had a great registration for this, so that's exciting to have. You're outnumbering us, those of you out in the virtual realm today, so that's great, welcome. Our guest today is Abe Lloyd. Abe is a senior instructor teaching both at Fairhaven College and the College of the Environment, which is an interesting blend. It's my own historical blend, so I appreciate that cross-pollination there. He got his degree in ethnobotany from UVic. How many of you knew you could get a degree in ethnobotany? Come on. Never even heard of it. So we're going to find out what that is, which is great. Abe, thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thank you all. Thanks for the invitation to speak. It's an honor to address you all. And I'm going to share with you something that is really important to me, something that I spent probably about the last 20 years focusing my studies on. You know, we often think of food as coming from the grocery store, but in fact, food is a product of the sun and the rain and the earth, the soil, and the people that grow it. And so today I want us to think about indigenous food systems and how the diversity that makes up the indigenous food systems here in the Pacific Northwest, how those indigenous food systems are managed, and most importantly, some lessons that I think we all can learn about our relationship with the earth from indigenous peoples. And it's a particular pleasure to share this talk in front of an interdisciplinary audience like the College of the Environment, where we have all sorts of disciplines represented. And I hope I have something in it for all of you, a little bit of science, a little bit of philosophy. And if nothing else, you could drool over the pictures of tasty berries.
Going for you then. Right.
Oh, yeah. So I want to start by honoring my teachers, and especially one of my most significant teachers, Quaxi Stala, an elder from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation up on the north end of Vancouver Island. And when I started my graduate studies, I was kind of an ambitious student and had a very academic mindset, and I showed up on his doorstep with a list of questions that I wanted to learn about one particular root food. Questions about how it was traditionally managed. And he invited me in, and we sat down at his dinner table and had a meal. And after the meal, I started going through my questions. And immediately he just raised his hands up and he said, wait a minute, I can't teach you like this. I have to teach you out on the land. I have to show you. And so our relationship changed from this very short period where I was trying to make it this like scholar-informant relationship to what became a really important master apprenticeship, where he was suddenly in control of my education and I was the apprentice. And I spent the next 10 years of my life working with him, and really was blown away by how interconnected everything is within his worldview. So he didn't just answer my questions about one particular route and how it was traditionally managed. He had to teach me the songs that his family sang when they canoed down the river to the root garden so they could harvest this root. He had to teach me how to make a digging stick so that we could harvest the root. He had to teach me how to make a bentwood box so that we could cook the roots. He told me the nuyum, or the myth time stories that incorporated this particular root species. And slowly, I began to see how it wasn't just this one particular root. This root was connected to everything. It was connected to all the rest of the different foods that were eaten as part of his traditional seasonal round, and it was connected to just about every element of his culture. So I want to raise my hands and say a big Gaelic Esla to Quaxistala, he passed away 4 or 5 years ago now, and I miss him dearly. So today, the emphasis really is going to be on diversity, kind of appreciating the uniqueness of the amazing diversity, not just of landscapes in this region, but of people, of food, and hopefully learn to see how a lot of these all connect, how all that diversity is related. I want to emphasize some of the traditional foods in this area that have really significant stewardship practices. And then I want to close with some lessons that I think we all can take away from Indigenous food systems, ways that we might be able to improve our relationship with the natural world, not just individually, but as a society. All right, so I'm going to start with this map here. This is a map of North American language families. And the point here is that I want you to recognize how diverse this region is culturally. Now, language is a good proxy for cultural diversity. Where you see different languages, the culture is probably also different. But this map isn't just languages, this is language families. So this is like a broader envelope that contains several languages. So for example, in our English language is part of the Indo-European language family that includes English and German and French, and even Hindi, the dominant language on the subcontinent of India. So you can see this language family envelope is quite big and contains a lot of languages within it. Well, here in North America, we can see that most of the linguistic diversity at the language family level is concentrated kind of on the west coast of the continent. And my talk today is really going to focus on what anthropologists call the Northwest Coast. And you're probably more familiar with the kind of bioregional term, the Pacific Northwest. Essentially, it's approximately the same area. So outlined in red, we can see that there are many language families represented here in the Pacific Northwest. And when I zoom in here on one of those language families, the Salician language family, we can see how it's made up of over 20 different languages, which are outlined in the bold lines. I know it's kind of hard to see, and about 40 or more different indigenous groups. And another thing that I want you to appreciate from this map is how the traditional territories of these indigenous groups roughly encompass watersheds. So this is significant, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that a watershed naturally has basically the maximum amount of biodiversity that you could have in a given area, because a watershed includes everything from the mountains, all the hills that drain down from those mountains into usually a single large river, all the different ecosystems along that river all the way down to the ocean. And so this is significant because in this region, people depend on that biodiversity for their livelihood and their culture and well-being. So getting back to the idea of language, I don't know if the mouse, the pointer here. So here we are up in, oops. Here we are in the kind of the fourth corner of Washington here. And just in our little neck of the woods, we have the Nooksack language. We have the spoken by the Nooksack people in the Nooksack watershed. We have the Upper Skagit people that speak a Lushootseed language, so a different language just south of us in the Skagit Valley. And then out more in the islands, the Lummi speak a different language. So those are 3 different languages, all represented in a very small area. Okay, so watersheds are important because we have a maximum of biodiversity. I think watersheds are also significant within kind of a multicultural context because they're relatively discrete on the land. The high mountains kind of make a good barrier between a different cultural group. And maybe that's one reason that there's so much cultural diversity in this area, is that the mountains kind of enabled people to be separate enough to develop different languages over time. Another significant thing is that the rivers are an easy way to get through the watershed, and they flow right through the center of a traditional territory. But I don't want you all to get too attached to these lines here, because from what I've learned from these indigenous peoples, these traditional territories aren't, the lines aren't like borders like between the US and Canada fixed on the land. Individual families, if they have relatives in another nation, they will also often have harvesting rights in that other nation. And so the boundaries would probably best be represented as kind of a gradient or a color mixing zone along the edges where it's not so discrete. All right, unfortunately, because of a lot of colonial forces, indigenous foods in this area have, the food traditions have eroded in some cases. And so what does that colonialism mean? Well, this isn't really a lecture about colonialism, but I want to mention how residential schools, these boarding schools where children were removed from their family and kept from speaking their indigenous languages and learning their traditions from their parents and grandparents had a really big impact, cultural impact on these people. And that's one big reason why some of these traditions have been eroded. Of course, a lot of other colonialism reasons, including like creation of reservations and private property, and disease was really impactful in this area. So going all the way back to the 1790s, when the first European settlers sailed into this area, there were huge epidemics like measles and flu, and unlike this pandemic that we're in now that, you know, maybe is, I haven't looked recently, maybe it's killed, I think, less than 1% of the global population. Well, these epidemics, each wave killed up to like 30% of the population. And these happened roughly every 30 years. It didn't just happen once, it happened, some of them happened 5 or 6 times. So you can imagine the impact that would have on a people. Today, some of these factors really continue. And if you're an indigenous harvester and you're worried about polluted waters, like fecal coliform in your clams, that's going to impact your willingness and ability to eat these clams, or heavy metals, or if your traditional beach is now private property, what does that mean for your ability to continue to eat these traditional foods? So loss of access and pollution are a big deal. And then introduced foods. And this actually relates to all of the factors I've just talked about, because if you lose access to your historic foods, then you're going to start eating other foods. And unfortunately, these introduced foods are often much higher in carbohydrates. And so diseases like diabetes and heart disease are twice as prevalent in indigenous communities as they are in the rest of our society. Okay, so now I want to dive into what exactly these indigenous food systems that I'm talking about look like. And I'm going to be actually speaking a lot in the past tense. I know I often try and avoid using the past tense when talking about indigenous peoples because they are still present on the land. They are still part of our communities. But unfortunately, a lot of these food systems, or components of these food systems, have been largely lost or are mainly known from historical accounts. So I'm going to try and present the most complete picture, as I understand it, of some of these indigenous food systems. And that means I'm going to use the past tense on occasion. And so one way that we learn about some of these long ago foods is by looking in the compost piles of indigenous peoples. And so this is a midden. Essentially, an archaeologist calls an ancient compost pile a midden. And archaeologists at the Burke Museum down in Seattle have examined middens from throughout the Salish Sea region, and they've identified far charred food remains and things like that, and compiled a a list of all the different species. And together with interviews that they've done with elders, they've determined that about 300 different species were eaten by indigenous peoples in this region. So think about culturally significant biodiversity, food, species, 300 different species. And so how does that compare with your diet or with a modern American diet? That's kind of a hard question to answer because we largely don't know the ingredients in a lot of the foods we eat. I've looked at a study recently done by the US Department of Agriculture that looked at 10 years of data, and it didn't actually parse it out to species, but more like major foods. And quite likely, Americans eat largely less than 50 species, and we get most of our calories from just a few species, like wheat is number one, number two is potatoes, number three is beef, number four is chicken. Dairy products and meat products are basically make up the rest of the list down to 10. So by and large, agricultural societies, I'm going to be doing a lot of comparison with agricultural societies. By and large, agricultural societies tend to focus their principal calorie intake from just a few kind of keystone, if you will, species, and like wheat and cow products or something like that, or corn. All right, so I think that's an interesting comparison. So much diversity in this area of food. And what are those foods? Well, a great number of them, probably close to 200 species, are animal foods, and most of those animal foods are actually seafoods. So there's variation, of course, throughout the region. On the outer coast, sea mammals were more important, and today seals, I think, are still pretty important. Historically, whales were really, really important. There are some accounts of people preferring to maybe go a little lean on other foods in the hopes that they might get a whale, because whale was such an important food, a status food. Here in the more protected waters, inland waters, clams are really important, and there's 5 or more species of clam, but all sorts of different seafoods. Now, I'm actually not going to talk much about seafoods because my interest is mainly in plant foods, and it's really the plant foods that I think need the most revitalization work, because some of the traditional knowledge around plant foods has been more impacted. So I want to run through some of these plant foods, and I'm going to do it by food group. Starting with roots. Turns out that in this region, there are easily over 25 species of root foods that are eaten, and they don't all ripen at the same time. Many root foods are best harvested kind of between the fall and the early spring, when the plants are dormant and they're storing all those calories in the root. But a few, like camas and onions, are actually best harvested in the late spring when the storage molecules are more digestible, if you will. So this is something I enjoy doing, is trying all these foods myself and trying to figure out how they need to be prepared and stuff like that. And so in the process of harvesting and trying them, I've photographed many of them. This is my attempt to represent all the ones I've tried, at least in one slide. But again, there are more that fit on this one slide. So a huge diversity. And I want to highlight a couple of them. Camas, how many people have heard of camas? Yeah, great. Camas is kind of the rock star of the region, I'd say, in terms of traditional food plants. And places like Mesha Island and March Point used to be really important traditional harvesting places for camas, and families would travel to those areas by canoe and dig square pieces of sod out of the ground, flip them over, and pluck the camas bulbs, and then return the piece of sod or maybe crumble it up and sprinkle seeds over the top. Some accounts even say that people intentionally left the biggest camas bulbs because they also produce the most flowers. And so that was a way of ensuring that the area would be the camas harvest would be abundant in future years. So this is not just casual harvesting of an ecosystem. It's in fact a very careful stewardship of a plant community. Now, camas bulbs, once they're harvested, they have this type of carbohydrate called inulin that isn't easily digested. And so the way to make them digestible is to cook them for a really long time, 2 days or more in some cases. And so people traditionally would have these camas pit ovens that were 4 feet across and might hold several hundred pounds of camas, and roast them for 2 days. And then after that period, they sort of change from this white color to this dark caramelized color, and they get really sweet. In fact, they're so sweet that many people say that camas is used to sweeten other foods, one of the few sweeteners from this region. All right, another food is wapato. This is actually one of my favorite root vegetables because it can be cooked so quickly, and it's really tasty. It tastes like a potato. It grows in wetland environments, and this is another resource that is traditionally managed. I worked with an elder, Ralph George, from near Chilliwack, a Stolo elder, and he said that his family would rake the detritus off the bottom of these marshes when the water level was really low, and that helped the camas plants come up more abundantly. In fact, the process of harvesting these plants actually increases their abundance, because little root fragments and little shoot fragments of the plant will grow into new plants. But usually when people harvest this, they wade into the water. It grows kind of in soft, mucky soil. They wade in like knee deep to chest deep, and they turn their feet, and the bulbs get shaken out of the ground, and they float up to the surface where they could be thrown into a basket. Sounds chilling. Process that I like to call wapatiptoeing. All right, bark cambium. This is a food group that is kind of obscure, and I think a little bit unique to the Pacific Northwest, although if you've heard the term Adirondack, evidently that's a term that means tree eaters. So I think barks were also eaten in the Northeast. But here, 8 different species of bark are eaten, and it's really the juicy cambium tissue that's between the wood and the outer or the inner bark. And some species you have to scrape these noodle-like soft tissue things from the tree, and in some species you have to scrape them from the bark after you pull the bark off. Seaweed is really abundant in this area, but even though many species of macroalgae are edible, for some reason in this region, it's really just one species of nori or porphyra that is eaten traditionally. This is a picture of my friend Lee Joseph laying some seaweed out to dry on rocks. All right, leafy greens. This is another food group that we tend to think of as perhaps being an important part of our diets. But here in this region, there aren't a lot of ethnobotanical accounts that describe leafy greens. And I think some of them may have, some of their use may have been learned after the contact period, which is totally understandable. I mean, people are always trading food knowledge. But as few as, or I guess as many as 6 species have some ethnobotanical literature. And many of them are actually not so leafy, but more like fleshy greens, like pickleweed and sedums. However, shoot vegetables are really important and diverse. So about 20 different species of shoot vegetables. Some of them, all that needs to be done is harvest them and peel the skin off, and then they're delicious raw. Some of them require a little bit more processing and cooking, like skunk cabbage, which needs to be cooked or else it'll burn your mouth. But a lot of diversity here. And so I want to highlight 3 of my favorites and 3 that seem to be the most ethnobotanically significant. So cow parsnips, both the leaf petioles and the shoots of the flowering stalks can be peeled and eaten. But this is one you need to be a little bit careful with, because if you handle the plant on a sunny day, just like garden parsnips, if you handle them on any sunny day, you might get a rash in your skin. And also, it's in a plant family that contains one of the deadliest plants in North America, the poison hemlock and water hemlock. So you want to be sure of your identification. But nevertheless, a very important traditional food that's still eaten today. Edible thistle, another very, very tasty shoot food. This is found more in like avalanche shoots in the mountains. And of course, the prickly outer skin needs to be peeled off. But if you do that before the plants flower, the shoot is very tender and really delicious. I actually like it more than just about any other analogous domesticated shoot vegetable. It's so good. And down here in the lowlands, we have a closely related species of thistle called bull thistle. It's not actually native, but it's very common. It's not quite as good as the edible thistle, but it looks in many ways like the edible thistle. And salmonberry, universally eaten up and down the coast still today. And the plant has a woody stem, but each spring it'll send up a few new shoots, the same way that maybe if you have raspberries, you see that raspberries will send up new shoots in the spring. Well, you could peel those, or you could break those shoots, peel the skin off and eat them. And Lee, who I showed the other day, in her language, they're called saskies. Anyway, all up and down the coast, they're an important traditional food that's still eaten. All right, here's where the diversity gets really astounding. Fruits and berries, over 50 species. But of course, you need to harvest these in the right season. So up on the top, I show those are black huckleberries, kind of from not ripe to ripe. And these are black cap raspberries and strawberries. I can't think right now. And these are the salmon berries. So lots of different species. Here's my attempt to represent as many as I could fit in one slide. We're actually in the center of diversity for huckleberries and blueberries in the genus Vaccinium. So we have 13 different types of Vaccinium fruit. We have 20 different types of currant, ribes and gooseberries, currants and gooseberries in the ribes genus, 3 types of strawberries, and yeah, so much fruit. But again, I just want to highlight the ones that I think are most significant. So salal, very common in the lowlands, and it picks really quickly and stores really well. And so this is, in the Salish region, this is the most principal traditional root or berry food. And there are accounts of actually a standardized unit of trading these salal berries after they've been dried into these cakes that in some cases weighed 10 pounds and must have contained 1,000 berries in each of these kind of fruit leather but thick cakes. And this plant actually is managed actively. So every 6 to 10 years, people would burn some of their salal bushes, and that would clear out the competing vegetation, kill off the trees that might shade the bushes, and recycle the nutrients. And then the salal plants, they grow quite well from the rhizomes that survive the fire. Up in the mountains, really tasty berry called Cascade blueberry and black huckleberries. They both grow in the mountains and are both really super tasty. And both are traditionally managed with fire. Again, Ralph George, the Stolo elder, said that his family would travel up to the mountains above Chilliwack and set up a camp and stay there for a week or more. And they would harvest mountain goat wool and hunt for deer and mountain goats and harvest huckleberries and blueberries. And they dried a lot of the berries so that they'd be easier to carry back down the mountain at the end of their trip. So this is a historic photo of a long trench that has a fire in it and all these berries on a mat that are drying next to the fire, just like craisins. All right, not too many food groups left. Actually, this is the last food group, seeds and nuts. So in most agricultural societies, seeds are like the most important food. But here along in the Northwest Coast area, seeds and nuts aren't really that abundant. In fact, no seeds are really eaten until you get down into Oregon, where the seeds of pond lilies are traditionally eaten, a food called wakas. And I don't even really know if you could, I guess technically they're seeds, but they're juicier fruits of giant vetch and beach pea are eaten by some groups further north along the coast. But we have two edible nut species, and these are really important. So the acorns, hugely important, and hazelnuts. And there isn't really much traditional knowledge known about acorn management in Washington, but down in California, there's a lot known about traditional acorn management practices where people would burn underneath the oak trees, and the burning would actually interrupt the life cycle of a weevil that infects the acorns. And so the quality of the acorns is really quite terrible if you don't have the periodic fire to keep those weevils from eating them. In fact, one of the weevil species infects both hazelnut and Gary oak acorns. Okay, so that's my overview of the different food groups and species. All told, there's about 100 different species from this region that are part of a traditional diet. So they're not all harvested at the same time or are ripe at the same time. And sometimes people build these cool seasonal round calendars. A seasonal round essentially describes what foods are available at what times of the year. So this is from Heidi Bowen's book, and we can see that at the top, winter foods, on the right are spring foods, summer is on the bottom, and fall on the left. So each food has its season. I know you can't see any of this, but this is essentially the list of plants that I mentioned in the talk, with months across the top, and different food groups. So red are berries, and brown are roots, and green are the vegetables. And just to give you an appreciation for how each of these foods has its own particular season. Each of their foods also has a particular place. And I think this is actually quite significant. So everything, I've heard many elders say that everything from whitecap to whitecap is, all the habitats from whitecap to whitecap are important. So the whitecap of the mountains all the way down to the whitecap of the sea. Essentially from as deep as a halibut can dive to as high as a mountain goat can climb, and all those habitats in between, really important for food production. And this is a game board that I had just a very small part in helping design. It was produced by Northwest Indian College as an effort to help revitalize food traditions in Indigenous communities. And the gameplay, you kind of move around throughout this traditional watershed territory to harvest different resources. All right, so again, I want to compare these food systems to kind of agricultural food systems. And when we think about the landscape, where is agriculture practiced? Well, agriculture in Western Washington, you can see in yellow here are agricultural areas. It's all in the lowlands, and it's mostly all in these lower floodplain kind of flat bottom habitats, like the Nooksack and the Skagit, the lower Skagit flats. So I think that's interesting. Like, instead of using an entire landscape, all these different habitats, for agriculture, we just use basically a very few, 1 or 2 different types of habitat. Okay, so more comparing these different food systems. So in this area, there aren't really any domesticated animals that are eaten. There's a domesticated dog, 2 actually types of domesticated dog, one for wool production and one more kind of a village dog for hunting and companionship. And there's a domesticated tobacco plant, but none of the food plants were domesticated. And I think from an both ecological and anthropological lens, this is kind of interesting. But I think it's best explained through an ecological lens, actually, because in order for something to be domesticated, well, it's easier to domesticate if you could isolate it from the rest of the wild population. And when you're managing say a root food within its ecological context, it's surrounded by other plants that it can share genes with. You're not going to be able to get that genetic isolation in order to domesticate it. It's also much easier to domesticate annual plants because they have a short life history than it is to domesticate perennial plants that have a really long life history. All right. So what can we learn through this comparison, and what can we learn from an analysis of indigenous food systems about how we can live more sustainably on the planet? And many of you have probably heard of permaculture, right? Raise your hand if you've heard of permaculture. Now, permaculture, I think, is a really great model, right? We're trying to develop permanent agriculture, essentially. And the permaculture model is to make farms resemble ecosystems. But I think indigenous communities actually have taken this, they haven't taken this a step further, but they've been doing this for thousands of years in a way that I think is more advanced and more ecologically sophisticated and sustainable than permaculture. So I'm going to unpack that in more detail in a second, but I want to reflect a little more on agriculture and some of the environmental impacts of agriculture, especially industrial agriculture, before I go there. So some of our most significant environmental problems, I think, are deeply entwined with agriculture. Population growth. Many farm families, especially in developing countries, need to be big because the family is the labor force for the farm. So population growth and agriculture, if you look throughout history, the two go hand in hand. Where agricultural peoples move, populations grow quickly. Habitat destruction is another really significant environmental factor. Farms, by and large, replace ecosystems. The prairies, 95% of the tall grass prairies in North America are gone. Why? Because they are now farms. So that's an entire ecosystem that is potentially, I mean, almost completely replaced. Soil disturbance is a huge problem. So when soil is disturbed, it erodes easily. And that eroded fertility goes into rivers and creates nutrient pollution. There's an estimated 4 tons of soil lost on every acre of farmland in North America. Now, many of us don't even know how big an acre is. It's hard to visualize what an acre is. So I did the math, and it turns out that every 5 years, 1 pound of soil is lost from every square foot, which I think is amazing. We depend on soil to grow food. yet we're essentially letting our soil wash away and blow away. It's like we're mining a resource, and it's not sustainable. Soil regeneration is nowhere near the rate of soil erosion, 100 times less. All right, chemical and nutrient pollution. I mentioned nutrient pollution in terms of soil erosion. There's a dead zone in the bottom of the Bellingham Bay, which is largely the result of excessive runoff and nutrient pollution. So all that organic energy settles to the bottom as it decomposes, it uses up the oxygen, and we have a dead zone. So that's a problem. And climate change even relates to agriculture. 25% of greenhouse gas emissions ties to land conversion, which I talked about before. So when you simplify an ecosystem, not as much of the carbon is held in living tissue, it just is in the atmosphere. So some very serious problems. I don't mean to say that agriculture is intrinsically bad. I'm just saying that it, I think, has more potential. So agriculture can be sustainable if it's within a matrix of, say, forests, where the cattle can go out, feed on some areas and come back and move fertility from a bigger matrix into the more intensively used area. Or if you have a Swidden cycle, you know what that is. Or in many cases, wetland agriculture is more sustainable because the watershed is essentially transporting nutrients to the farm because water is good at doing that. All right, so I want to more deliberately make an ecological comparison between indigenous food systems and our kind of American agricultural food system. So, and this is kind of from an ecological lens. So our farming tends to be monocultural farming, right? So that means we just manage for one species, a wheat field or a corn field, and essentially we try and poison everything else. In indigenous food systems, they're usually polycultures. So the camas meadow also probably has acorn trees growing out of it. And with the camas, you have onions and rhodeas and triteleas and lilies, and deer wander through and they can be eaten as well. So one big difference. Agriculture manages annual plants like grains, whereas in this area, the indigenous food systems manage perennial plants, okay? So this is a big deal because annual plants require regular soil disturbance in order for the seeds to germinate, whereas perennial plants, they don't necessarily require that regular disturbance. And so yearly tillage in one versus, I'd say, more a suite of ecologically appropriate disturbances to keep the ecosystem functioning, like periodic fire or pruning or something like that. Agriculture, all the foods we eat in North America basically are not native to North America. They're all introduced foods with just a few exceptions, whereas in indigenous food systems, they're all native species. And this, I think, is where one of the lessons that permaculture maybe can take from indigenous food systems. Permaculture has this model that we need to create a novel ecosystem, or an ecosystem model, but a novel ecosystem because we're bringing in sort of the best things from different areas. Lastly, our agricultural food systems mainly use just kind of one habitat type very intensely, those lower floodplains, whereas indigenous food systems have a moderate use of basically all the habitats from whitecap to whitecap. All right, so that's kind of the ecological lesson that I want to send you with. More of a philosophical lesson. This is a quote from Nancy Turner's book, but a quote from Daisy Seaweed Smith. She says, "We completely depended on nature. The garments that we had, the house that sheltered us, the foods we ate, the medicines we had, nature supplied it. And that is the reason why we respected nature as we did." Of course, many people say, "Oh, that's wonderful. You live off nature. It must be wonderful. You don't have to do a thing. Nature does it all, right?" People think that you don't have to do anything when you remove something from nature, and that is so far from the truth, because when you remove something, you have to put something back again to make that plant that animal, that fish live again. And so in indigenous societies, there's this deep respect and reciprocity with the natural world. And I think that's something that our society really can take to heart. Another story, this one more personal to me, when I was doing my field work up in Kinkum, man, Les Dawson often transported me up and down the river to my field site, and I got to know him quite well. And one day he invited me to go up the river fishing. So he took his daughter and I, and we hopped in his boat and we went up to this waterfall, beautiful waterfall, and we're catching these little cutthroat trout, and I got a couple, and so that was enough for me. So I started exploring around, and I went over to the side here, and I noticed that there was a pictograph. I don't know how well you can see that on the screen. So when Les was done, I took him over to it and I said, "Tell me about this pictograph, Les." And he said, "Oh, that's a mountain goat. That's me. That's my clan. That's my people." And it turns out this was his ancient village site just up the creek from the kind of modern village site. And his creation story talks about a mountain goat that traveled from the top of the mountain down and became the original ancestor for his people. So here's this person living within the context of his creation story, passing on traditional knowledge to his daughter about how to catch fish. I just was blown away with how connected he was to his place, to the land, and how he could not abuse that mountain because that mountain was his relative. And this is something that Nancy Turner writes about as a kin-centric worldview, to view the things around us as relatives rather than as inanimate, unliving objects. So one more thought related to that. And so, after seeing that kind of embeddedness in place, and thinking about how indigenous communities largely live where they have lived for countless generations, thousands of years. And here I am, when I was in college, I used to move just about every year to find a place that had cheaper rent or to get closer to this or that. And after I graduated, I'd move every few years for a new job or some new opportunity. And I was thinking how different this is, my lifestyle, from Les Dawson's and just about every indigenous person I've met while doing my field work. And I just want to throw out there that maybe this ability or this desire, compulsion to move for opportunity is part of kind of a colonial impulse. Indigenous people, by and large, like Les, their wealth comes from their access to resources on the land. Les can't just, in a traditional context at least, he couldn't just move to another area and expect to be able to go harvest fish there or something like that. Yeah, we're always moving for new opportunities, and we get new opportunities from moving. So I think that's interesting, and I think that's something that's worth more exploration. Our mobility in society definitely has an impact on the environment, because every time we move, we lose our connection, we lose the history. We won't be able to see how things have changed over years, let alone generations. Okay, I just want to close with one thought. I know this might still kind of be salt in the wounds to some people, but the College of the Environment used to be Huxley College of the Environment, and now it's just College of the Environment. And so what is it when we consider a name? Like I think we've learned several times throughout the last, 20 or 50 years that it's hard to name things after people because people are so fallible. And I just want to throw out there that maybe it's better in our situation here to consider a name that has kind of a multilingual, multicultural context. And we have a unique opportunity actually to do this, because all up and down this part of the coast, there was a trade language called the Chinook jargon. And this trade language was used not only between indigenous peoples initially, But during the contact era, it was a primary language spoken between pioneers at like logging camps and early settlers. I also think that a native plant, or a native organism at least, is kind of emblematic of this region, and environmental, the college of the environment represents this human connection to the environment. And what is more potent and embodied way to think about our human connection to the environment? I think through food. So I just want to throw out there in my final seconds the idea that maybe we call ourselves CAMUS, the College of the Environment. CAMUS is a Indigenous term. It was adopted in the Chinook language, and so it's used in a multicultural context. And it's a food, and so I think it really does connect us to the natural world. So with that, thank you all, and I'm happy to take some questions.
For just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I haven't looked into it recently, but I read maybe 5 years ago that at the bottom of Bellingham Bay, there's a dead zone. So when you get down close enough to the bottom in the depths, there's no more oxygen in the water, and so no organisms can survive down there. And yeah, algal blooms often contribute to these dead zones. Essentially, when you have a lot of dead matter that sinks to the bottom, as it decomposes, it uses up oxygen in the water. The organisms that decompose respire and they consume that oxygen. And so you have a dead zone. And this is quite common in a lot of big river systems, like the mouth of the Mississippi River has a big dead zone. Yeah.
Someone online asked, assuming we have the proper knowledge to ID edible species, is it ecologically appropriate for large numbers of people to start harvesting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just want to throw out there that for one thing, our society is so concentrated that if everybody just goes to the nearest area where there's, say, a camas plant and digs it up, that's not going to work. But we already have these huge areas. More, I guess, what I propose is that we already have these huge areas that we devote to cultivating non-native species. And what if we started deciding that let's incorporate some foods that actually are adapted to this climate and native to this environment, and we started converting some of our, non-native wheat fields and corn fields into camas fields and things like that.
Maybe one more in the room.
One question is, you mentioned that plants may be a site for ecological restoration, and I wondered if you could speak at all to any of the gendered components of harvesting, gender, women doing plant work, and if the colonial stuff that you talked about had any effects on gender expression.
I don't know a lot about that specifically, but I think there's definitely been a bias in kind of the documentation of plant knowledge, because a lot of early anthropologists were men, and they spoke largely with other men, and the men traditionally did more of the fishing and hunting. So we know more, I think, about the traditional fishing and hunting than we do about the plant gathering. Oftentimes it's just generalized as roots in old accounts and not so much the species. Or sometimes the root terms are recorded, but we don't know what that term applies to.
Okay, we're running out of time. There's a bunch of questions we didn't get to online that I encourage you maybe to email Abe and carry on that conversation. And in the room, we can stay here a minute or two if you have more questions as well. Abe, thank you. Next week, it's Oliver Graw talking about watersheds. So great, thanks.